Good morning. This is Jerry Brown. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about data information. It's a foundational concept, obviously, to software engineering. And specifically, we're going to be introducing a topic that some people may not be familiar with called data points. And just before I begin, just want to mention the target for these lessons are software developers who want to be able to think more in the software engineering frame of mind, or even the software architect frame of mind. And obviously, we also want to talk to other engineers and architects and get feedback. These lessons are normally given in a meeting environment first, on a Zoom meeting, which anyone can attend. And then once the meeting is over, then we put the recording onto YouTube, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and start this topic because the intention is to keep these short and just do a number of short topics, and then we'll see where we get to over time. Okay. So let's get on to data points. So the idea of a data point is actually something very simple to most people. It's just a small unit of information, like it says here in the definition. We just focus on the first half of this definition, the smallest atomic unit of information. So for example, if we have something like a person's name, okay, so I'll put my name here. Can't write too well on this, it's okay. So there's a name. Now, if we were to actually store this in a database or show it on a web form, this would actually normally be 2 data points, right? Because this would be the first name, and this would be the last name over here, okay? So that would be 2 data points in terms of the size, how we count them. And then if we added something else like a birth date, which I'm not gonna put mine there, but that would be another data point. And so the simplest aspect of data points is something that everybody's pretty familiar with. It's an attribute, a property of an object, things like that. These are data points that are used in software application, okay? The second half of the definition, though, is important, is that a data point in terms of the counting data points, like this would be 3, if we look at it just here statically, okay? But the other half is the context that requires coding in order to use it, okay? So there are usually 3 basic contexts right away for most software applications in which data is used. And that is in the UI layer, for example, web page, in the data storage layer, and in the coding layer, okay? So there is work required to represent this information on a web page, and to get the information from the web page into, for example, the database, okay? So when we count data points, we're not just counting the static picture, but we're counting in this unit of work over here, where we've created a form for the user using code, right? We've coded the form, they've filled out the form, they've submitted it, and now we're getting the information using code. We're getting the information off the web page and put it in the storage. So we would count those 3 data points in this context right here in terms of usage, okay? Then if we wanted to get the information out of the database or wherever storage we're putting it and work on it in code, then there would be another body of code that's required in code to set up the ORM objects that are going to, they're very common for synchronizing data between code and a data storage environment. And so we would count the data points here. And then, of course, if we were just sending data to the form, then we might count the data points there, okay? So it's when they're used and when code is required in order to use them. So this is a topic called data exchange. And so just doing basic data exchange, you usually have these 3 tiers, model, view, controller, the 3-tiered architecture of the client, client business data model. Okay, so across these basic tiers and any other context that we have to move the data between, we're doing some kind of data exchange, and it would usually require some amount of code. might be trivial, but it would take some amount of code in order to move it between those environments. So we count data points from the number of data points we have, and in each context in which we are coding for doing the data exchange. Okay. And then the last one here is what's called transformation use cases. Okay. So for example, let's say we have a birth date, but we have a requirement that when we render the web page, we want to show not only the person's birth date, but we also want to show their age. So here on the web page, we have a requirement to show the age. Okay. And so we might have a simple formula that calculates age, and it would consume the birth date, and it would also need the current date as an input. Okay, so there's a consumer producer pattern here in these transformational use cases, and we say how many data points do we need to consume in order to run the formula or the algorithm, and then how many does it produce. So if it had the birth date and the current date, obviously it could calculate the age, which introduces another data point. Okay, so it would require 2 in, 1 out. This would be 3 data points here for counting in terms of usage. Okay, which we do. Now, there's a lot of formulas. Algorithms can be very simple or they can be very complex. If we're calculating the temperature in Celsius from Fahrenheit, there's a basic calculation for that. So if we had temperature for some reason and they wanted to see both the temperature in Celsius and Fahrenheit, then we would get into the same. So this is a basic pattern. Okay. So what is the point of counting data points? All right. So if we look down here, number one, we use it to determine a metric called the size of the application. All right. So even in modern applications, we look at size of the application in terms of just the number of data points and the context. If we had a state model, we might be counting across that. But basically, the more complex the application gets, usually the size of the system goes up in terms of the number of data points we're dealing with and the number of contexts and use cases we're using the data in. And these are countable. So this system here, if we were to count it for size right now, we'd have a 369 for the data exchange. And in this one here, we'd actually go to 4, right? If we were talking about data exchange between the code, because we'd have this age that they want on the UI, or we might just add 1. But anyways, 369 basically is 9, and then these 3 here is 12. Might add 1 for 13. So basically, we'd say that this application, as far as we've described it so far, is 13 data points. Okay, and this is a metric that if you did it and I did it, we should come up with the same basic calculation. So in other words, I should count this out as 13 data points. You would count it out by the rules I described here as 13 data points. Okay. So then when we go to calculate effort and milestones, we calculate them with these data points in mind, because instead of just trying to come up with story points, which is very arbitrary, or come up with just, looking at and saying the effort, I'd say that's a week or 2 weeks or whatever, 2 days. What we look at here is it's the number of data points times the effort that we're going to assign to each data point. Okay. So for this application here, we might say, okay, the effort is going to be 1 hour. All right. So 13 data points times 1 hour. Then obviously, don't want to break anybody on the math here, but that's 13 hours. All right. In actuality, though, each data point usually does not have the same effort. You'll have very trivial uses of the data, like doing data exchange. These are pretty boilerplate patterns that we use. And so they don't take very long to set them up. We charge a bit of effort for them, but not too much, right? But then you're going to have some of these algorithms that they may just consume a few data points, but the code required to do the transformation of and produce something. So example, a cruise control, if we were to write the software to do cruise control in a car, there's only 4 or 5 inputs we need. What is the current speed? What's the desired speed? What is the rate of change? How long has there been an error between the desired speed and the current speed? So there's basic 4 or 5 inputs, and then a very simple output. Should we tell the car to accelerate, or should we tell the car to decelerate? And if we tell it to do either of those on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, how aggressively should it be accelerating or decelerating? And so that little algorithm would be another black box for cruise control. It would take some inputs here and it would output this one basic output, which is accelerate at a scale of 3. But when we look at, let's say these are 5 data points, okay? The algorithm for doing this is a very sophisticated algorithm. And so if we were coding this for the first time, we might put a high effort on this. We might say, just this little part of the system is, just feasibility and then implementation, and there's going to be a long time of integration with the rest of the systems in the car. And so the cost per data point of this would be very high. So the point is, we don't actually use one effort metric for all data points, but for each set of data points, data exchange, simple. If we're doing something complicated with a mobile or putting on a watch or something like that, then we might charge more, especially if it's the first time we're doing it. But anyways, that's we're going to come back to that later, but that's how that works together. Okay. And also using data points helps you account for data points across the 3 basic tiers. So they said we had the 3-tier architecture, whether it's expressed as model view controller or as a client, business, data, any of those type of things. You'll see that a lot of people drive their software design from the UI design. On a lot of applications, the only documentation that gets built is the UX designer does a design and they have a web page, and they might have all sorts of little features. Like I said, they have age. They'll put stuff on there that's actually going to take a lot of bit of work to provide that information. One way to get feature complete is to not hold the UI designer to what has been contracted so far. And so basically the idea is when you see a data point, then am I accounting for it in the UI later? Am I accounting for they want birth date and then they want the social security number? Okay, so if the UI, so it's really easy for a UI designer to go add that field to the web page, but then once you have it, then you have to account for it in the data store. And maybe if you're encrypting it or something like that, which we commonly do, then you'll have to say, okay, if I'm storing the social security number, then I need to get it off the web page in plain text, encrypt it, and then I can store it. Or when I get it back from the storage, I need to decrypt it so I can show it on the web page. And again, how complicated that you don't show it on the web page unless, there could be rules there. So anyways, another purpose of counting data points is you got to account for them across all these 3 basic tiers and every other context that you build into your application. The final point is it's a great negotiating tool when you're talking to PMs or the customer and they're concerned about the cost or delivery, especially if you're a third-party service, rather than just them negotiating on your price or effort. You can actually sit down with them and say, well, let's remove features. For version 1, do we really need the age? If we can get rid of the age, then we don't have to do these 3 data points of calculation here. We don't have to add a data point to the UI and to the code, and that'll save you 4 or 5 hours. And so I've personally used this many times to negotiate with a customer as opposed to just negotiating on my price or my delivery time, is to actually remove these points from the system, and then we don't have to waste any time building them here. We can add them in later. All right. And then lesson 2, we're going to get into, obviously, data points are applied in a much larger context. These data points would apply to a person. And so we're going to get talking about how we do data model design in the next page. But for today, this is the lesson. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, put them below. And thank you for your time.